You're tuned into RX Radio. Movement prescribed. Brought to you by Prescript.com. A personalized approach to keeping you healthy and making your best even better. Your hosts, Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Jordan Ginta.
Welcome back, everyone. Another episode of RX Radio with you as always. I am Jordan Shallow. Joined with me today, very special guest. We're going to be going over breathing. This is actually taken from an excerpt from one of our lab portions that we run with all of our Prescript courses. Speaking of Prescript courses, Prescript Skill Acquisition course goes live, classes start rather in January. Registration is now currently live. So if you guys haven't yet and are interested, head over to www.pre-script.com. Skill Acquisition is going to be run by Killian Hamilton. Incredible course, incredible concepts, very transferable, cross-discipline, whether you're an athlete, a coach, or clinician. With this idea of like 10,000 hours, like doing something for 10,000 hours to become like masterful or great master, whatever the fuck people are saying these days, it's just nonsense. Skill acquisition is a process. There's a science behind it, and we can start to see how this process can be utilized with exercise, selection, execution, progression, regression, adaptation, and optimization. Killian does a hell of a fucking job. Extremely excited for this course. And as mentioned, part of all of our courses come with Prescript Labs weekly lab sections where you get to kind of unmute and tune in and interact with lab instructors having to do with specific courses that we offer. So level 1, barbell, the upcoming weightlifting course, and now the skill acquisition course. So in this episode, on kind of back to enough paying the bills, this episode brought to you actually by one of our Prescript level 1 coaches, Brandon from Edmonton. Brandon and I go through, this is one of our earlier lab sections, and we actually go through the ins and outs of breathing. He kind of talks about the bolt scoring and the importance of breathing in a practical sense, and not kind of this like ethereal namaste in bed all day bullshit that people get. Breathing for performance is going to be the crux of this. Really interesting conversation. Brandon knows the ins and outs. He's extremely well read on the subject, a great coach. So I do encourage all of you guys to reach out with any questions to him. He's usually our go-to guy in the Prescript community when it comes to breathing. Just really, really enjoy this conversation. Letting kind of Brandon flex on us a little bit, which is great, which is always we enjoy. It's great to have level 1 coaches with such a subspecialty as this, and with breathing with so much bad information. I really enjoy this. So Brandon, thank you so much for coming on, man. I do appreciate it. We'll have to do this again soon. Hope you guys enjoy. I think it's a very it can be a nebulous topic if we don't constrain the objective outcomes of what it is we're talking about. Like you can end up going down some pretty, like I said, ethereal rabbit holes and ending up no better off for learning some of this stuff. But the stuff we cover today is to the point, and that point is breathing for performance. So guys, lastly, or just to reiterate, skill acquisition is now live. Have any questions, do shout out Killian Hamilton. He's got the manifesto on this one. Really excited for him to roll this out, guys. I've seen underneath the hood. This thing's a monster. And special thanks again to Brandon. Guys, do hope you enjoy the episode. Any questions on breathing, head on over to the show notes. Get Brandon's Instagram account and all that stuff there. And if not, guys, no other follow up with no further ado, as it were. Hope you guys enjoy this episode. We'll see you next week.
So I'm a strength coach in Edmonton, Alberta, Eleiko Strength Coach. So I say that not lightly because, I haven't challenged the CCS or CSCS or whatever. I've just gone through, there's a diploma program in my town. So I've gone through that, and I've taken a bunch of other certifications. I run my own coaching business called Seasoned Athletics, and I'm starting up a new community-based programming company called Mission Strength. As Jordan said, I'm one of the 10 oxygen advantage instructors in all of Canada. My hope with doing this and spreading some of that importance of breathing is to maybe up those numbers, because those are rookie numbers in this racket. And yeah, I'm gonna say here today that research has shown this and this and this, or I'll come up with numbers and shit. but just know I'm not trying to make it like a check out Brandon's big brain like moment, but just because research is literally like the only thing that will show some of these numbers. So yeah, that's it. Nothing special.
All right. Let's get out of here with that. Well, I mean, a lot of, like, I know a lot of guys on the call, similar backgrounds, similar pedigrees. So I think it'll be a good conversation, guys. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. Like I mentioned before, we're going to get into, we're going to kind of get into like the nuts and bolts, pun sort of intended there, Brandon, if you get the, hey, hold on, I'm going to unmute you. There you go. So we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of breathing and like actionable things. And I think that's the one, that was the unique thing I think about the book that was different from other books I've read on breathing, was that it was quite simple. I guess like maybe start with like the misconceptions. Like, what is the biggest thing that you see now that you've gone through this and you can put it into practice? Like, what are the biggest misconceptions that you see around breathing? Or like, you know, and maybe this is kind of a selfish question. Like, you see the biggest thing, and you guys can probably nod along with this, is like the Wim Hof method and things like this, right? It's what do you see out there that's being widely perpetuated as misinformation around breathing?
Man, there's a lot out there that's actually just not understood, and I think it's just, man, I don't know, like, I think it's just the awareness, or not. There's a lack of awareness around proper breathing mechanics, proper breathing biochemistry, and like what a deep breath actually is versus a diaphragmatic breath. I just think there's very little people out there that actually understand it well.
What would be your first action step? If someone comes to you from either like an athletic perspective, breathing is going to be something that you look to like monitor and measure. What is the first thing that you look to do as far as like, all right, how do we get a hold on this?
First thing is definitely assessment. Like, assessment's always the key to go. And basically anytime someone comes to you, before you're doing things, you should be assessing. So when you're talking about functional breathing, like when I'm looking at dysfunctional breathing, I'm looking for breathing through their mouth, upper chest breathing, hearing your breathing at rest, frequent sighing or yawning. Sometimes, like, I've got clients who, it's called paradoxical breathing. So they're like when they inhale, they're contracting instead of expanding their rib cage, and vice versa during exhale. And then easily noticing their breathing movement at rest. So that's the kind of thing, like, just watching them.
Maybe like I find it easiest when like trying to describe what dysfunction is. It's probably easiest to have like a solid definition of what like proper function is. Take me through a full breath cycle from proper inhalation, you know, mouth versus nose, diaphragm versus chest, and then all the way through. And one thing I want to point out is the difference between respiration and ventilation. Is something that's worth noting. A lot of people are out there talking about respiration, and where I think they should be talking about ventilation. So ventilation is likely the mechanical process that we're going to talk about, where respiration is more like the cellular diffusion of oxygen through the alveoli in the lungs. So that I think is something, again, language first, right? You guys have gone through, I know almost all of you have gone through the level 1 course, getting your language right, really, because if you talk to a doctor and you start talking about respiration, but you start using ventilatory terms, and you're talking about ventilation, not respiration. So take me through the full, you know, do the magic school bus thing, be the Miss Frizzle.
So a healthy breath should be light, slow, and deep. That's kind of what Patrick talks about in the oxygen advantage system. It is a system, so he uses those terms very well. Light refers to kind of the biochemistry. So you're reducing your minute ventilation. So you're not breathing rapidly through the chest. It's slow, so it's got a cadence to it. You've got a 4-second inhale, 5-second exhale with a pause, and it's deep. So you're using your diaphragm to actually draw that air into the lower air sacs and the lower lobes of the lung. So you're going to breathe in through your nose for sure. It's going to be diaphragmatic. You should have a gentle pause on the exhale. As you're inhaling, you should have that feeling of your lower 2 ribs or your lower couple ribs expanding outwards, and some posterior expansion of the rib cage.
Yeah, and that's something that's getting talked about more and more. Like, so defining like bucket versus pump handle mechanics of breathing, I think is something worth talking about. So like the flaring of the outer ribs and watching, like, because there's two from what I can gather and what I've read about like rib cage mechanics. Because in the level 1 course, like, I don't want to say we take a remedial approach, but we take a peripheral approach of shoulder, hip, and spine. Yeah. In the level 2 course, and it's like, but wait, there's more. But it's more like rib cage and pelvis. Yeah. Diaphragm and pelvic floor. Like, this is kind of like the outside in versus the inside out approach. But talk a little bit about that idea of lower ribs. Like, talk a little bit about like this idea of like bucket handle and even rib cage expansion. Because like when we talk about structure, right, we often just clump rib cage in with like, you know, meniscus, intervertebral disc. Like, it's just sort of this inert thing that's just kind of there, where in actuality it's quite dynamic.
Yeah. So like using your diaphragm to actually breathe is one of the most important things, obviously. When we talk about like the biomechanics, we're increasing our lung volume, we're increasing the ventilation perfusion, increasing oxygen uptake in the blood. So as you inhale, you know, that air is moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So that diaphragm descends, air comes in, starts diffusing with the blood and in the lungs. I don't know what else you want to like. How do you want to approach that? Like the diaphragm mechanics.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tough, right? Because you need to have somewhat of a basis of visceral anatomy as well, right? Because I think the common misconception with the diaphragm, from what I've seen, is that it's just sort of like this one umbrella thing, and there's like an there's a raising and lowering that I think is a little bit misleading in the mechanics, right? So it's really more like a hemidiaphragm, because we got to think like, what's going on here? Like, if we look at like my rib cage, what's beneath this? Like, we get really good at looking at like, you know, someone and like, okay, underneath the skin is this fiber of the delt, or underneath the skin is this fiber of the pec. But we get to here and it's like, all right, where are you going after you hit like rectus abdominis? It's like, do you know where your ascending colon is? Do you know where your dome of your liver is, right? So we start to think like it's tough because, and this is why I think when we start to talk, you know, deeper into the biomechanics, if we can grasp the peripheral shoulder, hip, and spine, that's like, all right, that's gold star, great, awesome. You'll help 98% of people. You want to bring 99% of people 100% of the way, understanding, you know, diaphragm and pelvic floor, diaphragm and pelvis, before entering into the final boss, which is the central nervous system, which most people just get to the end of diaphragm and pelvis and they go, nothing to see here. And they just walk away from the nervous system and they just throw out terms like, oh, nervous system fatigue. It's like, get the fuck out of here. You don't know a goddamn thing about the nervous system because it's hard. So I think talking a little bit about actually like size and shape, structure of the diaphragm, how it is it actually, you know, creates a negative pressure. What is, you know, the passive, like the passive component of breathing, the active component of breathing, maybe a little bit about the muscles. Like what does what, and I think that's really eye-opening when people realize what muscles are actually involved. So yeah, talk a little bit about maybe more of like the superimposition of function over what we usually just see as structure. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, the diaphragm itself is like this big dome-shaped structure, right? Like it inserts onto the ribs, like 6 to 12. Posteriorly, the diaphragm inserts onto the T12 vertebra and splits off into two little sections there. And then it attaches onto the lower lumbar vertebra, so L1 to 3, and then that's the right crus, and the left is that L1 to 2 intervertebral discs. So as you inhale, that diaphragm descends into the trunk or into the abdomen. And that's creating that negative pressure, right? So that's going to bring that breath in. Once that moves down, the intercostals move outwards and that pressure inside the chest is reduced, and that's how that air gets in there.
Yeah, and I think like some things to note there is like how low, and one thing to differentiate too is like it's lower in the back than it is in the front, because our ribs are lower in the back than they are in the front, right? Like my true ribs that stop on my sternum, it's like, well, that's really the level of around T8, right? Like your 8th thoracic vertebra, because your true ribs are the 8 ribs that attach onto your sternum. Then you go into false and floating. So, and I think a lot of times when we get a little bit deeper into like breathing and bracing techniques, the directional intent of your breathing, right? Like understanding that your body is a hydraulic and pneumatic system full of fluid and gases, and how we can start to prioritize where we put those fluids and gases can create an internal counterforce. And so this is why, like, you know, misconceptions, and, you know, we talk about thoracic extension. Depending on the plane you're loading in, thoracic extension could be closing off your ability to create that posterior expansion if you're trying to drive a counterforce somewhere around 120, 140 degrees in the overhead. Like, think of the plane. Like, if I have more air here, I'll be able to push more this way, right? So direction of breath, I think, and, you know, there's a lot to controlling the breath. And again, it's not more like, it's not this Russell Brand, like namaste in bed all day shit. It's like, you know, like from a performance standpoint, and that's what really got my attention with this stuff was like, oh, okay. Like you start to see that, you know, between like pneumatics of air, like in air positioning, and hydraulics of like, you know, fluid or plasma or blood positioning, it's like we're able to create, you know, actual leverage advantages and counterforce advantages from breathing. Because like the muscles involve like full exhalation. Like you start to tie in the, you know, the 12th rib on the back. It's like, well, what muscle attaches onto the 12th rib? QL, right? So here we have someone hyperlordotic. They're not being able to actually expand the posterior aspect of the diaphragm. Now all of a sudden they have a ton of issues in their lower back, and it could very well be from like stemming from bad reps, really. Like, and that's how I look at it. Like, if someone did a bad set of squats, it'd be like, well, yeah, no wonder your knee hurts. It's like magnified by the volume intensity coefficient, because it's like your volume is super low, but the intensity is super high. But if we flip that coefficient on his head and the intensity is really low and the volume, like how many times do we breathe a day?
Oh yeah.
Right. We should be how many breaths a minute? 15 breaths a minute, or if you're me, and 4 if you're Lance Armstrong. Is that kind of how it goes? Should
be around 6 breaths a minute. So about 4-second inhale, 5-second exhale, 1-second pause. Right. And that's one thing that people don't get, is they just like, they don't pause after they breathe too. But like you said, it's like, it's reps and sets essentially. So if you're fucking up your breathing every day, all day long, like that's going to affect things, you know? Like think about sleep too, right? Like when you're sleeping, if you're not breathing properly, if you're not actually using your diaphragm when you sleep, like that's 6 to 8 hours that you're fucking up.
Can I ask about the tape over the mouth? Because it's something that I've seen. Because like, look, most people that post about it on Instagram, it's like, man, if you only had that tape over your mouth during the day, my life would be sweet. I would really like it to shut the fuck up. Absolutely. But like, what is the purpose of taping your mouth shut when you're asleep? Because I would feel like I'm suffocating. I feel like I'm in a fucking in a bank safe, fucking going down in the ocean. Like I'd be dead.
Yeah. So they like, again, there's that research shows that like the nose and the diaphragm are connected, right? So as you breathe through your nose, you are going to get more diaphragmatic activation. So if you can use your diaphragm during sleep and you can breathe through your nose, it's really to promote nasal breathing essentially. Because mouth breathing they've classified it as dysfunctional. You're not getting as much, you're taking in more air, which obviously is not functional when you think about the Bohr effect and stuff like that, where you're over saturating your cells with oxygen, then you're decreasing the carbon dioxide in your system. So you're really just trying to breathe through the nose and ensure that everything's perfusing well and oxygen delivery is there. Now I tape my mouth, but
do you actually? But you're the only one on this call other than me that's unmuted, so clearly I want you to talk.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing there is like, and one of like the eye-opening things for me was like, you know, you learn in a pathological setting of like, oh, you know, what the dangers of oxidization, right? Like I remember there's this rich old dude that used to live, he was like a lawyer, and he bought this house that had what once was a copper roof. I was like, I'm no carpenter, but that's just an ultimate flex. It's like, I'm just going to put this really stupid metal on my roof just because I have a lot of money.
Really
but so he was right. It's like, but he was the guy who had a green roof because the copper oxidized and he had this dumb looking green roof. It's like, well, you didn't think that one through, did you? So he's got to pay some dude to like clean his roof every week. And it's like, well, how did that happen? It's like, well, oxidization. Right? And then we start to look at like, you know, the truth behind, you know, like lumen damage when we look at blood vessels and things around conditions of the heart. And we start to think like, look, oxygen in some places is not a good thing. And a lot of our issues, like cardiovascular issues, and not like cardiovascular issues like necessarily COPD directly or anything like that, or like emphysema, but we start to think of like, people who have like cardiac infarcts or myocardial infarctions. It's like oxidization is a huge part of that, because I think there's a dose-dependent relationship with oxygen that it's like the more the better, but that's not necessarily the case.
No, yeah. So like carbon dioxide, it regulates blood pH, right? It's a catalyst for the release of oxygen from blood cells, right? Or blood into the cells. So you need carbon dioxide in order for oxygen to be released. And that's that misconception, is that everyone's like, oh, I need to take in more oxygen. But that's actually the opposite. Like when you look at the Bohr effect, like the more oxygen you have and the less carbon dioxide in the system, the more that oxygen is going to be bound to the hemoglobin and it's not going to release. So you're not really actually utilizing it.
Yeah, because there's a difference between like how much you can get absorbed into your blood. Like the classic example for me is like, I love drugs in sports. It's literally my favorite thing ever. And there's no better sport. And it's like, yeah, we can look at like Bonds going yard and Sammy Sosa and like Roger Clemens misremembering on the Senate. But it's like, there's no better example of like, I think the physiological potential of oxygen when we look at cycling. Like if we look at like, so the big drug that they used to use back in the day is called erythropoietin, or EPO, which is like
erythropoietin or whatever the fuck it's called.
Yeah, so erythropoietin is a fuck off Siri. Sorry, my computer loves to talk to me. Siri's definitely listening to all of us. So erythropoietin is a hormone that's found in your long bones, right? So a lot of your blood your red blood cell generation comes from like your long bones. So EPO, what they used to do is they take this hormone that would stimulate red blood cell production. So when you have red blood cells, that's the oxygen carrying unit in our blood, right? Like that's what actually transfers oxygen around, as Brendan mentioned, in this molecule called heme. It's like this 4-piece thing that has this molecule in the middle, and iron uses anyways. So higher hemoglobin establishes what's called your hematocrit, right? And I love this now because people think that their elevation training mask will also help them with COVID. So you see a lot of like Banes in the gym. It's like, it doesn't matter who we are. And it's like, it doesn't mimic the partial pressure of oxygen, what I think is the biggest like misconception. So, that's why training at elevation is you're seeing like, the Eliud Kipchoge and pretty much everyone that runs, elite level marathoners who have a great expression of efficiency of oxygen and gas exchange in their body. They all come from places where oxygen is sparse. And I think when we start to think about breathing, we need to be comfortable with paradoxical relationships, right? Like, because we're so hardwired to think that, look, more is better. And it's like, actually, scarcity helps for efficiency. So if we can train in scarcity, we can actually become more efficient when, adequate or abundant amounts are there. I think one of the interesting things I want to talk about is that the carbon dioxide component that people miss. Right. So the fact that you said carbon dioxide is what actually detaches oxygen off of that heme molecule in your red blood cell and puts it into the tissue itself.
Yeah.
If you think of, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, because like think of how you could use this in your training, right? Like I found incredible like advantages of manipulating breath just in like, the kind of bro shit I do. Like imagine being at the end of a set. Right. And you're training some sort of volume, some sort of isolation, output, movement. And, you need the driver of oxygen to turn over cellular respiration so you can actually, depolarize a muscle contraction and actually move the weight or the load of the machine or whatever. If you hold, like with this principle, imagine holding your breath at the end of a set in like an eccentric phase of a movement and allowing carbon dioxide to actually start to mount in your blood system and affect your blood pH, which I think is something that is not to be glossed over and maybe something that we can touch on, like the idea of respiratory acidity and alkalinity. But as you accumulate more carbon dioxide in your body with like end of an exhalation, then you hold and you pause and you pause and you pause. Now the accumulation of carbon dioxide as a metabolite is building up in your body. But people look at that as like a waste product. We get sold that carbon dioxide is a waste product that we need to get rid of and expel so we can get more of this precious oxygen in, where actually what makes us efficient is how well we operate in this scarcity environment, or this metabolic state where it's like, look, we're going to pull that oxygen, we're going to allow that oxygen to decrease, but we're going to increase the efficiency of using the oxygen we have at our disposal by actually knocking the majority of that off by accumulating more carbon dioxide. You hit a set of 10, 12, you think you're done. Hold, pause in that exhalation state. Don't try and bring more air in, because you haven't used all of the oxygen that you have in already, right? So allowing the accumulation of carbon dioxide, then all of a sudden you wait, allow the carbon dioxide to knock oxygen off into the tissue. Next thing you know, you can actually start to perform more repetitions again, which I think is a really interesting application of like just the deeper physiology. People struggle with that paradoxical relationship of like, wait, less air, more reps? What? What's the first thing, like when you go to intervene, right? We've done the assessment, right? You look at the mechanics. Now it's like, all right, what is the most common intervention that you're going to start with? And I feel like you're rolling your eyes in the same way people will be like, so someone comes to you and they want to squat. What do you do? It's like, oh, fuck, man. Like that depends on 10 bajillion things. Well, I guess like, make it like sort of a not an algorithm, like maybe a heuristic is a better word. Mm-hmm. What do you see like from an action step standpoint? Like we hear about box breathing, we hear about Wim Hof. Should people be going in ice baths? Like what's the play? Oh,
definitely ice baths. No, there's a book that I read. It's called Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life. And that's kind of what I tell people. Essentially when they first come to me, I just kind of explain that importance of like shutting your mouth, breathing through your nose. And really when someone, like if we're taking the first actionable step, I just get them down and I coach them through some breathing. So just tell them what they should be experiencing, get them to close their eyes, get their hands, one hand on the belly, one hand on the chest, or hands on the lower two ribs, and just literally just try and breathe efficiently. Breathe light, breathe slow, breathe deep. And then I, get them, obviously, because like how you say, how you do one thing is how you do everything. If you're breathing functionally throughout the day and they're getting more aware and they build that self-awareness on their breath during the day, like that's where you're going to see leaps and bounds of improvement, right?
Yeah, because and I think the next question is always the same for me as well. It's like, yeah, but how many reps and sets do I do? It's like, motherfucker, like you're totally missing the point. Yeah. But I guess what is a common, like, can you overdo it? What's a common like prescription? Like everyone's like, oh no, fucking just do 3 sets of 10. And I'm just going to put that on the Instagram post and leave me alone. What's like the go-to breathing 3 sets of 10 starting point sort of prescription?
Yeah. So I kind of break it into 3, and that's kind of how the oxygen advantage system breaks it up. So breathing light, breathing slow, and breathing deep. I'll break all 3 of those up. If people can't breathe deep, if they can't breathe into their diaphragm, we might skip that for the time being and just work on the light and slow part. But essentially what we're going to be doing, if they can't breathe slow or whatever, if they can't breathe deep with their diaphragm, I'll focus on that and I'll focus on light. So I'll get them to slow down their breath. So it's very light. So you can almost not feel the breath coming in through your nose, and I'll get them to focus on their diaphragm. And then I'll leave the cadence stuff to another day. I'll focus on about 4 to 5 minutes or so of breathing for each of those exercises, about 3 sets. So it's 3 sets of 5 minutes.
And this is like a daily practice.
This is like a daily thing. So daily, if you can, like morning, night type of deal, go for a couple sets. While you're at work, just shut your mouth. More people should do that anyways.
Is there a transition phase? Like, is there something that like this is something that you're going to be doing like long term, or is there I guess a diminishing returns principle? Is there like an accumulation that, okay, I do this now, so I have to do less of it sort of thing? Like what's the long term trajectory of like a practice like this?
We I've run like training for about 4 weeks. And after that 4 weeks, people are usually pretty good. If they need more work, they can do those breathing exercises. But the more efficient the system gets, the more the car drives itself. So you can build up. We talk about Bolt score. Have you know about the Bolt score measurement appraisal kind of thing?
I'm familiar with it, but if you could expand on that, because if you haven't read the book, the Bolt score is likely going to be a new concept that I think is worth exploring.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So the Bolt score is called the body oxygen level test. Essentially, to do the test, you just take a normal breath in, silent breath in, obviously, breath out. You pinch your nose and you time the number of seconds until you feel the first definite desire to breathe in. So this is not a test of willpower. It's not like you're going until you can't. You're going until you feel your diaphragm contract or your throat start to contract a little bit. It's basically your body telling you that you need to breathe. So it's essentially measuring your body's chemosensitivity to the buildup of carbon dioxide. So if you're not sensitive to the buildup of carbon dioxide, as you hold your breath, your body's going to continue to extract oxygen from the cells. CO2 is going to increase, and your brain is basically going to tell you, okay, shit, levels are getting high here. Red alert, we need to breathe. So that's when it'll stimulate those accessory breathing muscles. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, right? Because your body has a fluid read on the safeguard system, right? Like as many sports as like we all watch, and like knowing a lot of you like by first name, like the amount of sports we watch, I've never seen anyone die of exhaustion. Just never seen it, which is crazy because like I know some athletes where that's almost their goal. Is like go until they can't go anymore. And everyone, like, you know, we can all think of like a really intense athlete. Like Prefontaine is probably one of my favorite athletes of all time. So you guys don't know, Steve Prefontaine was a mid-distance runner back in the day. And he was crazy. Like his famous quote is, the best pace is a suicide pace, and today feels like a good day to die. So he would just run flat out for 1,500 meters. Yeah, fucking rock on, Lauren. Like that's the most metal fucking thing of all time from a guy who's like 140 pounds. But he never died running. Like he never, like he's like, you know, what's his other quote? Like, you might beat me, but you're going to have to bleed to do it. It's like, dude, you're going for a jog. Like, relax. But don't relax because it's fucking metal. But if we think about it, like, we set, like, how far people are from actually killing themselves from exercise is so astronomically far away. Like, it's so, like, your physiological actual, like, in vitro limitations, if we look at cellular capacity and we look at the nervous system and we look at metabolism, it's the perception and how we've trained ourselves to be comfortable. Like when David Blaine was in the water for 19 minutes or 22 minutes in Vegas or whatever, like he's just trained his brain and been able to downregulate the processes that require oxygen. So that chemoreceptor, so we have like chemoreceptors and baroreceptors, which are basically, I mean, we have a lot of receptors, but they measure like the contents of your blood from like oxygen versus nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and all that. And then baroreceptors are more pressure, like blood pressure, volume, and things like that. But it's just your sensitivity to it, right? Again, and enter the paradoxical relationships. Like you're not going to be more sensitive to it and that's what you like. You want to get that stimulus in your brain and have that stimulus push further and further back. Even like your body will always safeguard you, right? Like there will be a point. I mean, yeah, if you're trapped underwater and people can definitely drown, but if you're doing this of your own accord, I think like you can watch people panic and freak out, which is pretty amazing to me because I've been in a room when people do it and like they try and like you said, like it's not a competition, but people are kind of competitive, right? So like you're sitting there watching a bunch of people like hold their nose just turning purple and like looking around the room like it's Survivor, like nope, not gonna be me, motherfucker, like it's gonna be you. And it's like, but you see the panic, and once the panic starts, then they're fucked, right? Because then the heart rate speeds up, and then they start utilizing more and more, and then contributing to their deficit, realizing that the actual physiological deficit that would cause them harm is so far afield from their conscious ability to get there. The idea is to move that buffer, that safety zone, a little bit closer to like what might actually be, but still far away from physiological damage.
Yeah, man, it's just exposure therapy, really. Like you're just exposing your body to those high levels of CO2, and it's just over time your body just gets used to it. So like if you're getting through, like, so if you do this test on your own and you know take that breath in, take the breath out, pinch your nose, time it, like anything under 25 seconds is considered dysfunctional. Anything under 25, and you'd be surprised at what numbers you can see, especially with some athletes. I know Patrick's talked about him having some athletes that come in with a Bolt score of like 8 seconds. Now low Bolt score, that's essentially like if we move, or if we like translate that to a VO2 max, like if you got a low bolt score, good fucking luck with your VO2 max, man. It's going to be low as shit. I mean, the average shift in hockey is 45 seconds. If you can't go all out for 45 seconds, like, dude, you're fucked. You can't do anything.
I mean, if people are coming in under 10, unless your last name is Bolt, like you're going to have some issues. Like unless you're running a 9.58, 100 meters, it's like you can hold your breath. I think they only do 4 breaths in the 100, but still just think energy systems perspective, like how quickly you shift into that next energy system. And also too, from a recovery perspective. And I think is like, that's the long-term play is like, yeah, your Bolt score is going to affect your work capacity in the gym. But when we want to talk about actual recovery from both metabolic and neurologic, that's going to be a huge, like you take someone with a high Bolt score, low Bolt score, put them under the same physiological stress. I mean, take 2 clones in the gym, same weight, same rep, same set, same rest period. You see performance is obviously going to be different, but then we think about recovery from that. So not only are you going to be able to drive further into the, required metabolic stress to drive adaptation at the neurological and cellular level during the session, your ability to actually recover from that is going to increase exponentially given your Bolt score.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's where kind of like the breathing light kind of comes into play. So when you're breathing light, like I said, you're kind of like reducing the amount of air that you're bringing into your nose. And obviously that's going to decrease the amount of oxygen in your system. You're not gonna be able to intake as much. Carbon dioxide is going to build up more and more. Now that's where the Bohr effect comes into play, and like harnessing like nasal nitric oxide and whatnot in your system. That's going to help that recovery because you're going to be able to get that blood circulating and delivered to the cells efficiently.
Can you explain that? I mean, some of you guys might be familiar with like the Bohr effect, but for those uninitiated, Bohr effect, when you mention that, what is, like, if you could expand on that a little bit? Yeah,
for sure. So the Bohr effect essentially tells you like the affinity to like oxygen to hold on to, or hemoglobin to hold on to oxygen. So essentially the lower the arterial CO2, so if you've got CO2 flowing in your system, if you don't have a lot of that, oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin more often or more readily. If CO2 starts to build up and it starts to get a little bit higher in the system, oxygen is less likely to hold on to hemoglobin. So it's actually going to be transmitted throughout your body a little bit better. So essentially, if you don't have CO2, your body has no reason to get rid of oxygen. So when you breathe in through your nose, arterial CO2 is higher and higher. Therefore, oxygen taken in is distributed more efficiently to the fatigued tissues.
I mean, this is like a totally uninitiated question, but do they look at corresponding blood values at all when they start to consider this stuff? Or is it more just like, look, what's in our purview? What can we measure? What can we manage?
They do a little bit. Some of the research that I've seen, they've looked at even just transcutaneous carbon dioxide as a treatment therapy. And like even within like 2 minutes or so, they're seeing those blood values increase in carbon dioxide. They're seeing the pH decrease in the blood of the muscle. And yeah, but I mean, that's pretty much it. That's all that I've read, at least. I haven't really read as much into that.
Well, I think it's a good transition when we talk about pH, because it's something I really want to focus on. Because like every time I see someone drink lemon water, I'm just like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? Like the idea of like, balancing your acidity with external, look, anytime we can drive an internal stimulus, it's going to be stronger than trying to elicit a response from an external stimulus, period, across the board. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's, you doing Graston instrument assisted myofascial, whatever the fuck, to like get blood flowing. He's like, what gets blood flowing? Get your fat ass up and go for a walk, right? That'll get blood flowing to an area better than someone assaulting you with a steel bat. Internal stimulus versus external stimulus, right? And in the case of like balancing acidity, because that's a real issue, especially with people who eat higher protein diets, i.e. meatheads. It's like you can create metabolic and respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, right? Which is how alkaline is your blood and how acidic is your blood, with the pH neutral hovering, what, 7-ish? 7? I think 7 on the nose.
7.4 kind of thing, yeah.
Right. So if you're like, I'm not saying I'm going full carnivore, but like I do sacrifice many a red meat on a daily basis, and understanding, look, that breakdown, the deanimation of amino acids is going to leave nitrogen byproducts, which is going to create, like an acidic environment, right? So people come in and they're like, I'm going to drink alkaline lemon water. It's like, why don't you just fucking breathe right?
Yeah.
Because internal versus external, right? Like the distilled lemon water thing, well, maybe we're going to put some cucumber in it today because, fucking Instagram, versus like, hey, maybe you should actually just control your metabolic acidosis with a respiratory system, which is two things that most people don't connect. They don't connect breathing, and that's why I like it's such a dynamic concept because, what have we talked about? We talked about biomechanics. We talked about biochemistry, right? That's such a driving factor in how we move, right? Like, have you ever seen or trained anyone who smokes cigarettes? It's like they literally move like the Tin Man because like there's no oxygenation. And a lot of that manifestation of a decrease of oxygenation is how that affects your metabolism and how it affects your biochemistry, right? And how the effect of biochemistry can actually have a visual effect on your biomechanics.
Yeah. This is kind of like a good place to introduce some fancy term called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. I know that gets me wet.
Triple word score there, son. Fucking right.
So if you Google this, it's an S curve. It's kind of a simple way to look at it is, if you breathe hard, you're getting rid of CO2. So you're breathing hard. Imagine you're just fucking carrying on the treadmill. You're getting rid of the carbon dioxide in your system. Now that makes the blood pH increase, right? So that curve shifts to the left. Now, if that curve shifts to the left, essentially what's happening is the harder you breathe, brings it back to the Bohr effect. The harder you breathe, the more red blood cells hold on to oxygen. Now that bond between hemoglobin and oxygen increases. The harder you breathe, the more the blood vessels constrict, the more your airways constrict, the tighter the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin. So as you exercise and the muscles producing CO2, it would benefit from releasing some oxygen. So in order to actually utilize this, you need to have carbon dioxide in the system. Otherwise, it's not going to release and you're fucked. So carbon dioxide, it combines it with the water in your blood to form carbonic acid. And that acid, I'm getting really sciencey here, but that dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. That bicarbonate, that's what buffers the blood. That is how you decrease that pH. And you were talking a little bit more about the lumen earlier. So the bicarbonate is reabsorbed by the blood, and those hydrogen ions get absorbed by the lumen and eliminated through the urine.
Yeah, and I mean, what is the accumulation of hydrogen ions, right? Like when we start to think about high-level athletes, that's your lactic acid, lactic acid or lactate, right? We're gonna air quote the fuck out of this. But like lactic acid, that burn is essentially the accumulation of hydrogen ions in your muscle, right? So the lactate as a byproduct of exercise is kind of like, whatever. It's the hydrogen ion that's like, this is really what's fucking you up. And the interesting thing now is I think, if I'm interpreting the new research correctly, they think that it's the acidity caused by the accumulation of hydrogen ions that actually might be a contributing factor to like poisoning muscle spindles and giving a sensation of delayed onset muscle soreness, which I think is a pretty neat thing to understand, because DOMS is something that hasn't really been understood for a long time, but there's research now to indicate that, look, maybe it's because our sensory unit of the muscle is the muscle spindle, right? Which is part of your intrafusal muscle fibers, and they break down into nuclear chain and nuclear bag fibers. We'll talk about that on another podcast, because I think that's super interesting. Again, most people get to the cliff of the nervous system and go, nothing to see here. But this idea that lactic acid and lactate threshold is really a threshold of work capacity, and it's basically there's two phenotypes. Right, so when a phenotype is just like a genetic expression, kind of two bookends. Like it's said that Michael Phelps, so imagine Phelps swimming a race. If there's any more oxygen deprived sport, it's drowning yourself while running horizontally through water. That's probably the worst you can be in introducing a metabolic environment that's sparse with oxygen. But it's said that he gets out of a pool, and to give you some context, most of us mere mortals, if we start to hit a blood lactate threshold of a level of around 18, 19, we're probably going to be throwing up, right? Like we're going to cross the finish line and just spew. Like it's just such an acidic environment. Our body cannot buffer at the cellular and at the what it would be, kidneys and liver, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Right. This is why meatheads use supplements like beta alanine.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not mistaken, I want to say agmatine sulfate does it at the liver, beta alanine does it at the level of the cell. I could be wrong on the agmatine sulfate, but beta alanine for sure is what actually helps buffer that hydrogen ion accumulation at the level of the cell and delay onset of fatigue, right? So people just have more cellular respiration capacity or endurance when they supplement with beta alanine, because that's what it's doing. It's shuttling out that hydrogen ion away from the muscle, so it's not like toxifying the environment, which muscle contraction would then be able to turn over. But if we think about like how it is that two people, so back to my Phelps story, it says that Phelps gets out of a pool after breaking 2 world records in a day, and he has a score of around 9.
Yeah,
which is crazy, which means he's just so phenotypically or genetically efficient at shuttling out the hydrogen ions. Like his body is so good at getting that away from the muscle so he can just keep going, right? But then there's some like super endurance athletes, and there's some people who can get up to 23 and 24. That's kind of more the graded exposures. Like, look, these people are just fucking sadists. Like they just love pain. They have the ability to push that physiological safeguard further and further and further through graded exposure. Now, I really think Michael Phelps is more on the superpower, like your body's ability to genetically turn over hydrogen ions and buffer it is going to be something that's pre-coded into your genetics. But we can outfunction that to a certain degree through bouts of graded exposure, which I think is super interesting, because where if we trained it, we could look at a blood lactate threshold of like 19. It's like, look, I'm done. I'm going into I'm seizing up and all this. But through practice, we can actually, in graded exposure, we can move that level higher and higher and essentially have greater endurance.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the whole breathing thing comes into play, right? Like you can do all of that with just focusing on your breathing and actually making a practice out of it. For athletes, a lot of them, obviously Michael Phelps is kind of excluded here because he can't really breathe when you're swimming. But if he's training in the gym, like for most competitive athletes who are working at maximal loads, like, yeah, you have to breathe through your mouth. You have to alternate between nasal breathing, mouth breathing. But anything less than maximal intensity, you should be nasal breathing if you can. And that's just, again, to increase that, decrease the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. Now, someone like Phelps or swimmers, I know they hyperventilate sometimes before they swim. So they'll actually purposely get rid of carbon dioxide as much as they can. And then when they're in the water, this can be dangerous. But when they're in the water, their brain's not getting that sense or that signal that they're running out of oxygen. So they can go for longer without those signals coming to your brain. But I mean, if you pass out underwater, you're fucked.
Right. The lifeguards, you'll be all right.
Yeah.
But like, it's an interesting thing too, because we haven't really talked, and this is one of the biggest driving factors is the control over the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah. Right.
This is something that I think is like, when we look at HRV, heart rate variability, most people think the underlying mechanism of HRV is a subset of neurorespiratory physiology called cardiac sinus arrhythmia, right? Or respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is basically people hear arrhythmia and they're like, oh yeah, it's something Jordan has because he eats too much red meat. Like it's bad, right? Like he's got like a pig valve in his heart or something. And he has an arrhythmia. It's like, no, that's actually a good thing. Arrhythmia just means like a delta. Like in the day, how high is your highest cadence of your heart rate? And what's your lowest low of your cadence of your heart rate? Now we start to think of think of the autonomic nervous system. Here's overarching title. Autonomic nervous system breaks down into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Right? So parasympathetic, rest and digest. Sympathetic, fight or flight. Right. And think of two situations where we might stimulate parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Right. I was in the Bahamas August of last year, and some fucking Bahamian dude, while I was eating breakfast, broke into my kitchen through the back door of my Airbnb. I didn't know what I was going to do with the spoon that I had, but motherfucker, I took off after this guy with a spoon, chased him down in my shorts, running through like alleys, but gets back, motherfucker. But like the first thing I did when homeboy Rasta rolls up through the sliding door, it wasn't like, it was ready to go, right?
Yeah.
Took that like a cute, sharp breath in, sympathetic nervous system. Let's fucking kill this motherfucker with a spoon, right? And then like, I remember getting accepted into grad school, right? Like, has anyone ever had like a prolonged test or something hanging? What's the first thing you do, right? The sigh of relief.
Yeah.
It's an exhalation, right? It's parasympathetic. But the thing with like our sympathetic and parasympathetic processes is that they're autonomic. They're co-pilot. Your body's like, look, you deal with your girlfriend and your cell phone bill, and we'll worry about peristalsis, digestion, the accommodating for light in the room, and the rest of it. You can barely manage your minuscule life. We'll autopilot these other tasks for you. Gotcha. But breathing, like, look, I can't tell my GI tract to like, hey, I need you to digest this food really quickly because I got to go train. Right? Or like, I can't tell my pupils in my room, like, you know what? I'd like to see more light in this room. Please dilate. But what I can do is I can take control of my breath, right? Because, you know, probably not in this call, but sometimes during the day, you're breathing autonomously. Yeah. It's part of that autonomic nervous system. But every now and then, if you got to Top Gun it and you got to fucking take the con and ready to go, you can bring it out of autopilot and into conscious control. So you can inadvertently backdoor the access and control over autonomic processes, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Right? So what do a lot of people do? Short, shallow breaths in, sympathetic state. You know, and that's going to drive a lot of like, you know, neurorespiratory, neuroendocrine. It's going to drive a lot of like, you know, your resting state, your metabolism, your blood values. Just if like, okay, if we could train people, like you said, to default to that low, slow, and deep breathing, we can default them into a parasympathetic state. And this is where I think people get lost is like, they go, oh, like, you know, it's kind of hippie, it's kind of crunchy, but it's like, I think the goal is like, you don't want to be the gardener in the garden, right? Like you do want to be the warrior in the garden. So you can be chill, eating your breakfast, you know, Bahamian guy comes and you're ready to go. Right. Where I think having that delta, and that's what that delta represents in HRV. And some of you guys, if you've heard of Aura Ring or Whoop bands or things like that, that's really what those measures are of HRV. It's like, how low can you get low? And it's, again, getting comfortable with paradoxical relationships, right? Like, wait, the lower I can actually control my breath and the amount of breaths per second, the higher I can actually turn up. And it's like, yeah, exactly. The delta is what we're after, right? I'd rather have someone that has a peak sympathetic output here, and this is going to sound really weird if someone listens to this as a podcast, like I would rather take someone who has a lower peak of their peak sympathetic output, but has a greater variance from peak sympathetic to peak or full depth parasympathetic, if we're calling these inverse, and with a bigger delta, than someone lives here. Right? The guy that lives here is the guy who's like honking at you for not like making the left turn on the arrow or whatever, right? This guy gets out of his car and he's a punk. Like this, you're going to knock this guy out. If you can have this fluctuation of your states from parasympathetic to sympathetic through controlling that, okay, we're moving the autopilot system from autonomic to control. I'm at the wheel of my breath and now I can control it. You can actually start to better reprogram that autopilot system when you shift back into gear, which I think is something that's really unique to breathing that most people don't consider.
For sure. And yeah, that heart rate variability, it measures your body's biofeedback, right? How it's responding to stresses in the body. So obviously a high HRV is a good thing, or like it's important, that delta, right? And when you look at respiratory sinus arrhythmia, not only is it helpful for just you in general, just your well-being, but it controls the rate of gas exchange in your body. Like the heart rate's synchronized with respiration. So as you inhale, your heart rate increases, right? As you exhale, the heart rate decreases. It slows down a little bit. So when that heart rate's high and when you're inhaling, that air in the lungs, which is like oxygenated, and then when the oxygen starts to decrease, it starts to slow down your breathing rate as you exhale, right? So that's important.
Well, especially from an athletic perspective too, right? Like, cause and you see it. I always make the comparison of wrestlers, right? Like you watch Olympic wrestlers, you watch like the Russians in the back at the Olympics, they're asleep. Like fucking Sergey goes over to Igor, kicks him with, hey, wake up, asshole. You got to go fight for a gold medal. Meanwhile, like you see the Americans just like hopping around, like, listening to the Rocky theme song, running up the library stairs. It's like, you gotta fucking relax, dude. Yeah. What are they doing, right? The Russians are looking for the low, right? So they can get fucking high. Right? It's almost like, how do you jump really high? Well, it's like, I want to go that way. I'm not going to not sacrifice downward movement to jump up, right? Because the lower I can get, obviously, like not not a great example, but like if I go low first, I can actually go higher. If someone just goes here, they're like, ugh. Yeah. Not that my vertical jump is much better if I bend my knees, but like, you know what I mean, right? Getting low first allows you to express a higher state of sympathetic arousal, and you can do it controlling your breath. So if you're training, it's like, look, before a set, obviously we have to consider the biomechanics and direction of breath and bracing and breathing and the superimposition and the rib cage and the pelvic floor and the pelvis and the rib cage and intrathecal pressure and intra-abdominal pressure and all these tens of thousands of things we need to consider. But like, look, if you want to get up, get breathing, right? Like if you're not, like, you don't want to sit there and focus. And like from an execution standpoint, sometimes you don't want to be too up, and you want to find a level balance depending on how much skill you need to exact. But like, look, these days you're not really feeling it. It's like, look, if your body doesn't care, you start inhaling, like you really start to drive that inhalation, you're going to drive that sympathetic stress, which is going to be like a sympathomimetic. Like that's caffeine. Caffeine is a sympathomimetic. It stimulates a synthetic pathway of stimulation of the central nervous system, the sympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system. So it's like, look, in a single session in a workout, you can worry about your respiration to drive your readiness prior to a set. At the end of a set to drive further metabolic fatigue, so we have neurologic on the front end, metabolic on the back end, we can use the accumulation of carbon dioxide to start to knock oxygen off of the binding unit of hemoglobin in the cell into the actual tissue. And it's like now all of a sudden we can exponentially begin to like expand on our performance. And all we had to do was just pay attention to minor cues of like, what breathing does in the neurological and metabolic level.
Yeah, for sure. And like to go back a little bit to respiratory sinus arrhythmia, it's like that number, like if you could quantify it, like that's a reflection of how well your autonomic nervous system is functioning. Like it's used as an index of parasympathetic tone, like how well it's working. And like for you and I, like muscle tone, like how tight your shit or how tight your muscles are, like that's one of the most important things. And that slow, deep breathing, that signals our parasympathetic nervous system to calm down and return to rest. So if muscle tone is controlled by the nervous system and we can do something to calm that shit down, like that's just going to make such a big difference. So like breathing while you're stretching is helpful, obviously, like, cause you can control that nervous system. If you can relax and calm that down, your body gets that signal to chill out and relax. Stability, a muscle might be unstable, which is like, that's what you go through, right? That's what the whole kind of system is. It might be tight because it's unstable, which the nervous system, you start looking at that, the muscle feels tight. Breathing calms down the muscle. What's it called? Breathing will calm down the muscle so it can relax and you can actually stabilize it more efficiently.
Right. And think too about like muscles that we don't have voluntary control over, which like when we talk in a more clinical perspective and more about pain management and pain science, like all your true back muscles of your spine are not controlled voluntarily. They're all controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which we talked about branches into parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? So if I need to drive that slider, that wheel more to the parasympathetic side, and if I have someone with chronic back pain, well, think of like, all right, well, maybe their back pain could be mechanical or biomechanical as, aberrant breathing patterns have accumulated over time. And the perpetuation of this pain is actually being driven neurologically because we can't downregulate the sympathetic stress due to the fact, so it's a positive feedback loop. And I don't want to say positive in like a good way, because poor mechanics are going to drive poor neurological resting state and drive more sympathetic function or sympathetic action, which is going to, end up turning over more of the same biomechanical issue. And it's a compounding effect in the negative. But the fix compounds in the positive, right? We fix the mechanics of the breathing, inadvertently fixing the neurology behind the pain perception, especially when we talk about the spine and the unique properties of the dorsal root ganglion and things like that, and how we can actually like hack the breath. And I hate using that word because it immediately takes what we're doing and puts it behind fucking blue light blocking glasses. And all of a sudden I'm eating modafinil for breakfast and I'm fucking Dave Asprey selling you coffee is the only thing you should ever shove up your ass. But if we can like backdoor the nervous system, speaking of shoving things up your ass, if we can backdoor the nervous system through our breath, we can actually begin to get a grasp on like the underlying perceptions of pain, the hyperexcitability of the dorsal root ganglion, which is the motor output to all your spinal muscles, all your true spinal muscles, your erectors and multifidus, so on and so forth. So yeah, you can do a bird dog if you want. you start pulling one of these, but if you're not, if again, you're not focusing on that deep internal, right? And like our body is meant to protect things in order priority of evolutionary, from an evolution biology perspective. You see this in your brain, the central fissure of your brain. The sensory perception for things that are most vital to you are deepest in your brain. So if I get punched in the head, right? Who remembers the Joker movie? Or like not the new really freaky one, like that's like that's fucked up. When they shoot De Niro, it's like you're kind of cheering for him, which is weird. But like the one with Heath Ledger, it's like when you see him in the interrogation room and he fucking comes up behind him and he whacks his head off the table. What does he say? You don't start with the head because he can't feel the next one as much. That's not true. If the next one was a stab in the gut, you'd still feel it because your visceral organs are buried deep inside that central fissure. So you can get hit in the head, but still be hyper aware of like your viscera. You can be hyper aware if someone stabs you in the gut, right? So your body is built in labyrinth to really protect the things that have allowed us to evolve over time. And I think breathing and walking, right? To make it as simple as that. Like those are the defining characteristics of human function, but it's more than just like, pumpkin spice lattes, Michael Kors Rolls Gold watches, and like Instagramming your journaling every fucking morning, right? So I know you're time sensitive. We're on a bit of a crunch, guys. I screenshotted the questions. We'll maybe riff on these at another time. We'll schedule like a live Q&A over the Facebook, and we'll get to these questions here. If you have any more, just toss them up in the Facebook group. Brandon, I really appreciate your time, man. I really appreciate coming on. We'll have to do this again in more depth and detail. And when the world opens up again, we'll have to do this in person when we get up to Edmonton. Guys, if you have any last minute questions, toss them in right now. If not, we're going to jump off. This will be up in the Facebook group for all of you who weren't able to attend. For those of you who were, really appreciate you guys tuning in, hanging out with us for the hour. If not, if you guys have any other questions, just shoot us an email. Brandon, you want to give us the details on where to find you, Instagram and all that? Because I mean, I'm sure people have seen you in the Facebook group because I tagged you and everything. But where do people find you on socials and all that?
On Instagram, that's pretty much the only thing I use, and even then I don't really use it that much. But it's at coach_Brandino, Brandino. And then if you want, I'm following, or I'm starting that programming company. It's at mission_strength or at mission strength. Fuck, I don't know. But yeah, if you've got any questions, just shoot it over, and yeah, I'd be happy to help in any way.
Yeah, I'll put it up in the Facebook group. We might even release this as a podcast. I'll put it in the show notes just so people can kind of sniff you out a little bit more, because I think it's stuff that the information is so bad, it's so widespread, but there's good stuff out there that's really applicable, guys. So hopefully you took something away from it. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to him directly, because if you have questions for me, I'm just going to send you his way anyways. So guys, enjoy the rest of the day or night, wherever you're at. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to you all soon.